Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 49th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this episode, I'm going to discuss one sort of intuition or image I had a long time ago when I first had my spiritual awakening, and which kind of makes sense to me now because obviously at that time I had no idea what I was talking about. It was just pure ideas, unfiltered ideas, and it was really difficult for me to express them and understand them. But now with more experience, I think I can deep dive into some of them. So this episode is going to deal with babies and dimensions, and it'll become clear actually what I mean by those two, why I'm linking those two together um, as the episode progresses. But first, I'd like you to listen with me to Carl Sagan. So let's start with um, a video of the astronomer, astrophysicist Carl Sagan, um, about dimensions. So, if you've already seen this, because it's a very popular video, feel free to just jump ahead 7 minutes from now. But it's a really important prerequisite. So, here goes.
In discussing the large-scale structure of the cosmos, astronomers sometimes say that space is curved, or that the universe is finite but unbounded. Whatever are they talking about? Let's imagine that we are perfectly flat. I mean, absolutely flat, and that we live, appropriately enough, in a flatland, a land designed and named by Edwin Abbott, a Shakespearean scholar who lived in Victorian England. Everybody in flatland is, of course, exceptionally flat. We have squares, circles, triangles. We all scurry about and we can go into our houses and do our flat business. Now, we have width and length, but no height at all. Now, these little cutouts have some little height, but let's ignore that. Let's imagine that these are absolutely flat. That being the case, we know, us flatlanders, about left, right, we know about forward, back, but we have never heard of up, down. Let us imagine that into flatland, hovering above it, comes a strange three-dimensional creature which, oddly enough, looks like an apple. And the three-dimensional creature sees an attractive, congenial-looking square, watches it enter its house, and decides in a gesture of interdimensional amity to say hello. Hello, says the three-dimensional creature. How are you? I am a visitor from the third dimension. Well, the poor square looks around his closed house, sees no one there, and what's more, has witnessed a greeting coming from his insides, a voice from within. He surely is getting a little worried about his sanity. The three-dimensional creature is unhappy about being considered a psychological aberration, and so he descends to actually enter flatland. Now, a three-dimensional creature exists in flatland only partially. Only a plane, a cross-section through him can be seen. So, when the three-dimensional creature first reaches flatland, it's only the points of contact which can be seen, and we'll represent that by stamping the apple in this ink pad and placing that image in flatland. And as the apple were to descend through, slither by flatland, we would progressively see higher and higher slices, which we can represent by the apple. So the square, as time goes on, sees a set of objects mysteriously appear from nowhere and inside a closed room and change their shape dramatically. His only conclusion could be that he's gone bonkers. Well, the apple might be a little annoyed at this conclusion, and so not such a friendly gesture from dimension to dimension, makes a contact with the square from below and sends our flat creature fluttering and spinning above flatland. At first, the square has no idea what's happening. It's terribly confused, utterly outside his experience. After a while, he comes to realize that he is seeing inside closed rooms in flatland. He is looking inside his fellow flat creatures. He is seeing flatland from a perspective no one has ever seen it before to his knowledge. Getting into another dimension provides as an incidental benefit a kind of X-ray vision. Now our flat creature slowly descends to the surface, and his friends rush up to see him. From their point of view, he has mysteriously appeared from nowhere. He hasn't walked from somewhere else. He's come from some other place. They say, for heaven's sake, what's happened to you? And the poor square has to say, well, I was in some other mystic dimension called up. And they will pat him on his side and comfort him, or else they'll ask, well, show us, where is that third dimension? Point to it. And the poor square will be unable to comply. But maybe more interesting is the other direction in dimensionality. What about the fourth dimension? Now, to approach that, let's consider a cube. We can imagine a cube in the following way. You take a line segment and move it at right angles to itself in equal length. That makes a square. Move that square in equal length at right angles to itself, and you have a cube. Now, this cube, we understand, casts a shadow. And that shadow we recognize. It's, ordinarily drawn in third grade classrooms as two squares with their vertices connected. Now, if we look at the shadow of a three-dimensional object in two dimensions, we see that, in this case, not all the lines appear equal. Not all the angles are right angles. The three-dimensional object has not been perfectly represented in its projection in two dimensions, but that's part of the cost of losing a dimension in the projection. Now, let's take this three-dimensional cube and project it, carry it to a fourth physical dimension. Not that way, not that way, not that way, but at right angles to those three directions. I can't show you what direction that is, but imagine that there is a fourth physical dimension. In that case, we would generate a four-dimensional hypercube, which is also called a tesseract. I cannot show you a tesseract because you are trapped in three dimensions. But what I can show you is the shadow in three dimensions of a four-dimensional hypercube or tesseract. This is it. And you can see it's two nested cubes, all the vertices connected by lines. And now the real tesseract in four dimensions would have all the lines of equal length and all the angles right angles. That's not what we see here, but that's the penalty of projection. So you see, while we cannot imagine the world of four dimensions, we can certainly think about it perfectly well.
So that was a really, really interesting video, of course, one that I very often talk about. Here, he talks about dimensions as in physical dimensions, space, for instance. And of course, many times when you hear about the fourth dimension, people say it's time, for instance. But I prefer to say that dimensions are logic layers, what I call logic layers of the universe, or holons. That is, very often I would say that a star is the bridge between physics and, and chemistry, with planets orbiting suns. That is one dimension. Then the living cell is the bridge between the world of chemistry, where you have individual little molecules and stuff, and animals, humans, and we, of course, are the bridge here. You just add animals, trees, plants, and we are a dimension in the sense that we are the bridge between biology and something else. And that to me is much more relevant in terms of dimensions than thinking about them in spatial terms. And these are all nested one inside the other. And it ties in very nicely with all the esoteric teachings, such as the central sun, for instance, or saying that the sun is kind of like our god or something. And in primitive religions, um, in my view of the universe, everything is within, nested inside, and projected outside. So we live within the sun. Um, everything is kind of inside out. Um, and planets are a kind of evolution of the sun, if you will, an evolved um, an evolved form of a sun, of a star, and living cells are an evolved form of a planet, and we are an evolved form of living cells. So you could think of humans as being actually an entire galaxy of planets uh, within our living within ourselves and having sort of adventures. You're like a galaxy dreaming of itself, having a dreaming galaxy that is not yet awake to what it actually is. And then humans interacting with each other is galaxies interacting with each other. So it's like the Milky Way interacting with something else. And a human collective, therefore, that sort of reaches a higher level of consciousness collectively is the universe becoming conscious of itself, because all of its galaxies sort of become aware of themselves. You could even think that maybe the movement of the galaxies, when you see galaxies swirling around each other, swallowing each other up, or destroying each other, parallels very much our dualistic and our very much non loving kind of behaviors, and being still sort of stuck in this unconscious dream. But let's get back to the title of, because you may wonder why I call these babies and dimensions. If if these are the dimensions, actually, the different bridges between various logic layers, as I call them, or hold ons, or parts that form a system, which then becomes a part in a larger system, and so on, then I had a very interesting sort of revelation about babies. See, babies, when they're first born, now, of course, I'm a terrible drawer, but they lie flat, they have a little hole in the head, and you could say that from what I had as a vision is that babies are actually flat, not just that they're laying on their back, but they're actually flat. Like their view of the world is as if you would compress them, and everything, all of this, the body, would be just one, like a living cell, basically, like a cell, because they ultimately are one cell that multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. And once it's born, it's sort of a transcendental experience. Those trillions and trillions of cells that multiplied and multiplied, but it has a sort of an inkling that it's something bigger, but it doesn't know yet what it is, and it's stuck in its perception of itself as a cell. So you can imagine that a child, actually a baby, everything is compressed and is at the same level. You could say, therefore, that the stomach is right next to the brain and right next to the heart, and everything is on the same plane, like a pancake, basically. If you compress a baby to make it look like a pancake, And you can see that it's as if its emotions, its thoughts, everything is one dimensional or two dimensional, basically. Everything is just, it's mixed up and bundled up, you see? Um, it has very instinctive reactions. It's as if the mental body and the emotional body are fused together. And if you take that vision, then indeed their heart is actually beating right in the middle of their brain, basically. From our view, because we have reached a level of consciousness of our dimension where we view ourselves more or less as we are, but babies are still stuck in here, the second dimension. They don't yet realize that they're here. And all of the process of growing up, crawling, and all that, what I had as a vision is that actually what adults do is they pull that pancake upwards, and it's as if the heart sinks into the chest and the brain sort of grows apart from the heart. And it's as if you were, as an adult, what you're doing in the process of growing up for babies is the separation of the mental and the emotional and other and bodies, and getting accustomed to actually seeing themselves in this new way. And the reason I was showing you that video of Carl Sagan is that it's actually exactly what the apple did to the square, the little square that was lying flat there on flat land. When it took it upwards, swirling in that third dimension, and suddenly giving it a perspective that it never had. That is what adults do with babies, basically. We pick them up, we play with them, we toss them around, and gradually, they grow. Their consciousness grows from being perceiving themselves as a cell with everything on the same plane, and all of their organs sort of bundled up and being in the same place, and sort of each organ then finds its own unique place: the heart, the stomach, the brain. It's as if all seven chakras for the baby are at the same place. So seven in one. And the process of going up is this separation of the chakras and their gradual sort of um, configuration, if you will. That depends, of course, on what the adults, how far the adults have advanced. And that's also, when we're talking about karma, for instance, that you transmit to your children. If you have issues with your chakras, then of course your child, because it mimics the way that you behave, it's going to structure those organs and those things in a similar way. And so it also explains why babies, for instance, are very close to why you could say that they think with their stomach, because their stomach is actually in their brain in terms of their level of consciousness, because they are flat, and I mean completely flat from their consciousness and their perspective. We of course don't see that. Of course we see them from the perspective of an apple looking down at a flat square, saying, well, why doesn't it just fly? And it's not really flat, it's it's a cube. It could be a cube. Why doesn't it just fly away? Or why doesn't it perceive that other dimension? But children are actually flat, and the fact of growing up is when you can sort of differentiate your stomach from your thoughts. For instance, you're not thinking with your stomach anymore. Your stomach is not in your brain anymore. And so I had this vision, basically, that is the process of growing up, is actually just simply moving from the consciousness of being a cell to being a human. And you can say that you can see that actually that babies also go through the stage of like almost animal type behavior in adolescence, and then gradually they move on to becoming more and more a human. Now, of course, in my other videos, I'm saying we're not human yet. We're somewhere along the path. We're somewhere here. Fully human would mean that we are already aware of the fact that we are part of something bigger. Like this, the moment that hydrogen atoms form a sun, um, they're no longer just a sort of a cloud of hydrogen atoms. They're something greater, and also they understand that they are part of a larger system as well, like the fact it's like a solar system, for instance, something bigger. Now, it's also very interesting, and this is going a bit beyond the theme here, is that um, just imagine if you, as a human, for instance, you're a scientist, and you take your hand and you have a petri dish here with some cells in it, individual cells that have no consciousness of being anything else but cells, and you place your finger in that petri dish, just the tip of your finger. How would those individual cells perceive what you have just done? And I believe that they would actually perceive the same as what Carl Sagan was just explaining when that apple sort of went into the second dimension and tried to manifest or materialize itself. They would see the tip of your finger, like a few cells from your finger, and they would give them a form which they could relate to and understand. That is, they would think that they are individual cells, like they are, because they could not imagine that they could be anything else. And they wouldn't understand if those cells were suddenly disappearing, or if they were, why those cells would appear to have some characteristics that are not the same as they have. Like, for instance, that these cells somehow um, have access to this energy, this source of infinite energy, while they are still struggling for finding food and eating each other and competing in that petri dish for resources. How come those cells from the tip of your finger um, are seem to not need to have food, and they're just they're living off of prana? Of course, from your perspective as a collective global organism, you know that all the thing about oxygen, about eating, and all that stuff. And from your perspective, it's far from infinite. But from the perspective of those cells, what you're doing is quite magical. And for your cells, for their lifespan and for their experience, that energy, the oxygen that you're breathing, the food that you're eating, is magical and is like infinite energy. Um, and so I had this thought that perhaps when we come into contact with aliens from our perspective, it might be the exact same experience. That is, we, first of all, if they come into our dimension, then we will not see them as they are. We will see them depending on our level of consciousness. And so we will not even see a tiny portion or fraction of what they actually are, their real appearance. We would see like the tip of a finger from a human. And how much can you tell from the tip of a finger from the perspective of an individual cell? How much can you learn about a human by, if you're an individual cell here in the petri dish, by just looking at the tip of his finger? Actually, not much, nothing, pretty much nothing. And so, I was also playing along with these ideas that maybe Jesus and some of these other high spiritual teachers are like these petri dish cells that basically one of them has an awakening and suddenly attaches itself or jumps in consciousness and is like that square that was like taken into a new dimension, and sort of understands that ultimately it is already part of something bigger. It's just that by being conscious of it, it can start living as if, or have access to things that other cells don't have access to, because ultimately it's all a question of consciousness, level of consciousness, which attaches you attaches you to one dimension or another. And so, in the same way as a baby sort of um, grows out of this cell consciousness into the consciousness more and more of a human, if you're a human and you go a little bit further here and you go beyond, then you understand you're also part of a whole, and that materializes as multiplications of bread or walking on water or doing miracles, which are not really miracles. They're miracles only because, only from our perspective, of course. From another perspective, it's totally logical, and we wouldn't call our bodies magic, even though they are. And so, sometimes I have fun in saying like Jesus is the same as us saying like giving Jesus the form of a human is like saying that this the cells in the tip of the finger, those individual cells in the petri dish would say, "Oh, um, that's Jesus," when Jesus is actually the whole human here. That's Jesus. Jesus is like the collective organism of all of the sum of those things, and the only thing you perceive from Jesus is the tip of the finger of that being, that consciousness, because it's just so, yeah, it's so evolved, it's so huge. The level of consciousness is just something unfathomable, unimaginable for us. And you just see the tip of the finger, and the same for aliens, the same for plenty of other things. And so it's also really important to understand that um, since you have these dimensions, when an alien enters our dimension, it's not this. I mean, they're not really in the physical dimension the way we think that they are, because we are in our own little materialistic bubble with science and all that stuff, and that's a sort of a hermetic consciousness prison, if you will, or construct, and all they can do is to penetrate it and communicate with us is give us an illusion of an experience that resembles the physical but is not really the physical. So it can be hallucinations, it can be changes of states in consciousness, but they are not here in the same way as an animal is here or a plant is here. And I mean, you cannot break these rules, basically. And what happens at their state of understanding is one thing. What happens at our state of understanding, like the cells in the petri dish, is also a totally different thing. And so you can imagine that those cells in the petri dish themselves are in a consciousness bubble of their own kind of reality, which has nothing to do with ours. They're living in their own world. And from time to time, there may be interactions between our dimension, our world, from our perspective, our 3D world, and their world. But the way they would experience it, the way they would give it a form to that interaction, um, is really specific to their level of consciousness. And what we think we're doing is not what they're perceiving. And so it's really difficult to explain, but I guess you'll get. I hope you'll get it. You'll get the gist of it. So I hope you found this video interesting. It was just trying to expand on a vision I had of babies being flat. I thought that was funny, and the process of growing up. So, I mean, feel free to comment if you have any questions, and see you in the next video.